Chapter 18. The Dream of a Village. For generations, peace had been little more than an impossible dream. Every clan had suffered unimaginable losses. Fathers buried sons, children grew up without parents, and entire bloodlines disappeared from history before they had the opportunity to leave a lasting legacy. The Senju and the Uchiha remained the strongest of the great clans, but even they could no longer ignore the cost of endless war. The battlefield had become a place where neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Every campaign ended much as the last had. One clan might gain a temporary advantage, only for the other to recover and strike back months later. The names of the fallen continued to grow, while the reasons for fighting became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the hatred that had accumulated over centuries. Hashirama understood that nothing would change unless someone chose to end the cycle. The dream he and Madara had shared as children had never left him. Even after years of bloodshed, he refused to believe that the future had to resemble the past. If the Senju and the Uchiha could somehow stop viewing one another as enemies, then perhaps other clans would eventually follow. It was a radical idea. No one had ever proposed that rival shinobi clans permanently unite rather than compete for contracts. Doing so would require each family to place its trust in people responsible for generations of suffering. Many believed such reconciliation was simply impossible. Hashirama disagreed. Rather than waiting for another battle, he reached out to Madara once more. This time, the discussion was not between two boys hiding beside a river. It was between the leaders of the two most powerful clans in the world. Hashirama spoke of the future they had once imagined together. He argued that the constant competition for missions served only the interests of feudal lords while ensuring that shinobi families continued sacrificing their children. If the strongest clans united instead of competing, they could create a single settlement where missions would be accepted collectively, resources could be shared, and children would no longer be raised expecting to die before adulthood. Madara listened carefully. No one understood Hashirama's vision better than he did, because he had helped shape it years earlier. Yet experience had changed the way he viewed the world. He had seen agreements collapse, alliances dissolve, and promises broken whenever fear or ambition took hold. A village founded upon trust sounded noble, but Madara questioned whether trust alone could survive the realities of human nature. Even so, he did not reject the idea outright. For the first time since their childhood, the possibility of ending the war seemed real. The greatest obstacle no longer lay between Hashirama and Madara. It lay within the countless shinobi who had spent their entire lives believing that the opposite clan could never be trusted. Convincing two leaders to seek peace was difficult. Convincing generations of warriors to lay down their hatred would prove far more challenging. Hashirama's proposal spread quickly through both clans. For many members of the Senju, the idea of ending the war was welcomed. They had fought the Uchiha for generations and had paid an enormous price for every victory. Peace offered something they had not experienced in centuries, the possibility that their children might inherit a different world. Within the Uchiha, the reaction was far more divided. Many remembered every family member that they had lost to the Senju. They had watched brothers, parents, and children die on battlefields where Hashirama himself had stood among their enemies. The suggestion that they should suddenly trust the Senju seemed impossible to accept. Madara understood those concerns better than anyone. He wanted peace. He had dreamed of it since he was a child standing beside the river with Hashirama. But he also understood that peace built upon empty promises would not last. If the Uchiha agreed to unite with the Senju, his people needed proof that the hatred between the clans had truly ended. According to the account preserved in the manga, Madara presented Hashirama with an impossible choice. If Hashirama genuinely wished to prove his sincerity, he could either take the life of his own younger brother, Tobirama Senju, or take his own life. Madara believed that only a sacrifice of that magnitude could erase the blood debt separating the two clans. Hashirama did not hesitate. Without argument or hesitation, he chose to sacrifice himself. He drew a kunai and prepared to end his own life before Madara could stop him. The moment stunned everyone present. Hashirama was not making a political gesture or attempting to manipulate the situation. He fully intended to die if it meant ending the war. To him, no individual life, including his own, was worth more than the possibility of lasting peace. Watching Hashirama make that choice forced Madara to confront a truth he could no longer deny. The boy he had met beside the river had never changed. Years of warfare had not diminished Hashirama's belief that peace was worth any sacrifice. His dream had survived every battle, every loss, every disappointment. Madara stopped him before he could carry out the act. In that moment, he accepted that Hashirama's conviction was genuine. The war between the Senju and the Uchiha finally came to an end. It was not because one side had defeated the other. It ended because two men who had once dreamed together as children finally chose to trust one another again. The agreement between the Senju and the Uchiha sent shockwaves throughout the Shinobi world. For centuries, their rivalry had defined an entire era. If those two clans could lay down their weapons, then perhaps peace was not as impossible as everyone had believed. Other clans soon began joining the alliance. Families that had spent generations fighting alongside or against the Senju and Uchiha gradually gathered around the new settlement, taking shape in the Land of Fire. For the first time in recorded history, rival shinobi clans chose to live together instead of apart. The dream born beside a quiet river had survived the bloodiest era the world had ever known. Now it was finally beginning to take physical form. The agreement between the Senju and the Uchiha marked the beginning of a new era. For the first time in history, rival shinobi clans did not simply agree to a temporary ceasefire or a short-lived alliance. They chose to build something together. On land within the Land of Fire, a new settlement began to take shape. Families that had spent generations hiding behind fortified compounds now found themselves living alongside former enemies. Homes replaced military encampments. Training grounds were built for the next generation. And roads connected districts that only a few years earlier would have belonged to opposing clans. The Senju and the Uchiha were soon joined by many of the other prominent clans of the Land of Fire. The Sarutobi, the Shimura, the Akamichi, Yamanaka, Nara, Aburame, Inuzuka. Each brought its own traditions, techniques, and history, but all agreed to become part of something larger than any individual clan. Rather than serving only their own families, they would protect the village as a whole. The settlement itself received its name from Madara. Looking over the forest that surrounded the growing community, he observed the leaves dancing in the wind and proposed the name Konoha Gakure, the village hidden in the leaves. It was a name that reflected both the landscape of the Land of Fire and the hope that the village would shelter future generations from the endless wars that had defined the past. The establishment of Konoha quickly drew the attention of the Fire Daimyo. For generations, the great nations had relied upon independent shinobi clans to wage their wars. The emergence of a permanent village capable of organizing many powerful clans under a single leadership represented an entirely new political and military system. Recognizing both its strength and its potential to stabilize the region, the Fire Daimyo formally acknowledged Konoha as the military village of the Land of Fire. That recognition transformed the village from an ambitious alliance into an official institution. Other nations watched these developments carefully. Some viewed the village as a remarkable experiment. Others saw it as a dangerous concentration of military power. Regardless of their opinions, none could ignore what had been accomplished. The two greatest rival clans in history had ended centuries of warfare and created a new model for the shinobi world. The success of Konoha would soon inspire other great nations to establish hidden villages of their own, forever changing the balance of power across the continent. For Hashirama, the village represented the fulfillment of a promise made long ago beside a quiet river. Children from different clans could now grow up together instead of meeting for the first time on a battlefield. They could learn, train, and build friendships without first inheriting generations of hatred. Although the future remained uncertain, the foundation for a more peaceful world had finally been laid. For Madara, however, the dream was only partially complete. The village existed, the war had ended, but peace itself was still fragile. Centuries of mistrust could not disappear simply because walls had been built around a shared home. Madara believed the greatest challenges still lay ahead, and he watched carefully to see whether the ideas that had created Konoha would survive the realities of governing it. The dream had become reality. Now it would face its greatest test. Chapter 19. The First Hokage. The founding of Konoha accomplished something the shinobi world had never seen before. Former enemies now lived behind the same walls. Children from rival clans trained together instead of meeting on opposite sides of a battlefield. For the first time in centuries, many families experienced years without constant war. The village prospered quickly. Homes were constructed where military camps had once stood. Roads connected districts belonging to different clans. Markets began to flourish, and shinobi, who had spent their entire lives fighting, now found themselves protecting a shared community instead of competing for contracts. The experiment that Hashirama and Madara had imagined as children appeared to be succeeding. Yet beneath that success, old suspicions had not disappeared. Peace had united the clans, but it had not erased generations of grief. Many Senju still remembered relatives killed by the Uchiha. Many Uchiha carried the same memories of the Senju. Trust was growing, but slowly. As the population of the village expanded, another question demanded an answer. Who would lead it? Until then, the alliance between the clans had been sustained largely through the mutual respect shared by Hashirama and Madara. But a permanent village required permanent leadership. Decisions affecting every clan, missions, security, diplomacy, and relations with the Fire Daimyo could not depend solely upon informal agreements. A single leader would have to be chosen. Among the villagers, support quickly gathered behind Hashirama. His reputation had spread far beyond the Senju clan. Many of the smaller clans respected his strength, admired his willingness to sacrifice himself for peace, and believed he possessed the temperament necessary to unite people who had once been bitter enemies. His dream had inspired the creation of the village itself, and to many, it seemed only natural that he should guide its future. Madara expected a different outcome. He had fought beside Hashirama to create Konoha, had shaped its ideals, and had even given the village its name. He believed the Senju and the Uchiha had founded the village together, and that both clans should stand as equals within it. Instead, he watched support gather almost entirely around Hashirama. The decision had not yet been formally made, but the direction seemed increasingly clear. Madara began to question whether the balance he had envisioned truly existed. From his perspective, the village had united the clans, yet political influence already appeared to favor the Senju. Even if no one intended such an outcome, he feared that the Uchiha would gradually become isolated within the very village they had helped to create. Hashirama recognized his friend's concerns. He repeatedly expressed his desire for Madara to remain at his side, and believed the village could only succeed if both the Senju and the Uchiha continued working together. To Hashirama, the title itself mattered far less than preserving the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Madara was less certain. He had spent his entire life learning that power naturally concentrated in the hands of those who held authority. If one clan consistently occupied the highest position within the village, would the others truly remain equals? It was a question that very few people were asking. Madara could not stop asking it. The answer would determine not only his future, but the future of Konoha itself. The question of leadership could not remain unanswered forever. As Konoha continued to grow, the Fire Daimyo and the village's leading clans agreed that a single individual would be needed to guide the new settlement. That leader would represent the village to the Land of Fire, oversee its military forces, and make decisions affecting every clan that now called the Hidden Leaf home. The position became known as the Hokage. Although several influential figures lived within the village, the overwhelming majority of support centered on Hashirama Senju. His reputation had been forged over decades of warfare, but it was his character that ultimately earned him the trust of the other clans. Time and again, Hashirama had demonstrated that he valued the village above his own ambitions. He had been willing to sacrifice his life to end the war with the Uchiha, and many believed there was no one better suited to place the needs of the village above those of any individual clan. With the approval of the Fire Daimyo, Hashirama Senju became the first Hokage. The decision was celebrated throughout much of Konoha. To many, it represented the beginning of a new age. The village now possessed a recognized leader, and the dream that had once existed only in the imaginations of two boys beside a river had become a functioning society with a government, a military, and a shared purpose. Hashirama accepted the title reluctantly. He had never pursued authority for its own sake. To him, becoming Hokage was simply another responsibility, one that existed to protect the village and preserve the peace that so many had sacrificed to achieve. Madara viewed the decision differently. He did not object because Hashirama lacked the qualities of a leader. No one knew Hashirama's character better than Madara himself. What troubled him was the process. The village had been founded through the combined efforts of the Senju and the Uchiha, yet the Uchiha had found themselves increasingly excluded from its leadership. The other clans had naturally gravitated toward Hashirama, and with his appointment as Hokage, Madara began to fear that the balance promised at the village's founding was already beginning to disappear. Those concerns were not widely shared. Most villagers believed the selection had been made fairly and saw Hashirama as the obvious choice. They viewed the first Hokage as the leader for the entire village rather than the representative of a single clan. Madara remained unconvinced. The more he observed the village's political structure, the more isolated he felt. Decisions were increasingly being made without him, and although Hashirama continued to treat him as a trusted friend, Madara could not ignore the growing distance between himself and the other founders of the village. His doubts extended beyond politics. Madara began questioning whether the cycle of hatred had truly ended or whether it had simply taken a different form. Open warfare had ceased, but suspicion still lingered beneath the surface. Old rivalries had not disappeared overnight, and many villagers continued to judge one another through the lens of generations of conflict. Hashirama believed those wounds would heal with time. Madara feared that time alone would never be enough. It was a difference in perspective that would soon grow into something far more dangerous. For the first time since the village had been founded, the dream that united Hashirama and Madara began to pull them in opposite directions. As the years passed, Hashirama devoted himself completely to protecting the village. Under his leadership, Konoha continued to grow. More clans joined the Hidden Leaf. Trade flourished throughout the Land of Fire. And children, who would once have been raised exclusively for war, began experiencing something their parents had never known: a relatively peaceful childhood. To Hashirama, the village proved that his dream had been worth every sacrifice. Madara, however, became increasingly isolated. Although he remained one of the founders of Konoha, he began to feel that his influence within the village was steadily disappearing. The trust he had hoped would unite the Senju and the Uchiha never fully materialized. While open hostility between the clans had diminished, Madara believed suspicion still lingered beneath the surface. His greatest concern centered on the future of the Uchiha. Madara feared that as the village continued to grow, decisions would increasingly be made by those who did not understand or trust his clan. He warned the other Uchiha that one day they could find themselves pushed to the margins of the very village they had helped create. Most of the clan disagreed. Years of warfare had left the Uchiha exhausted. For the first time in generations, their children were growing up without constant battles against the Senju. Many believed that remaining within the village offered the best chance to secure a lasting future for their families. They chose Konoha, not Madara. For perhaps the first time in his life, Madara found himself standing alone. Even members of his own clan no longer shared his vision. Hashirama refused to give up on his friend. He repeatedly reached out to Madara, hoping to convince him that the village still needed him. Hashirama believed their partnership had created Konoha, and remained convinced that they could overcome any disagreement, just as they had during their childhood. Madara could not accept that optimism. The dream they had shared beside the river had been to create a world where no clan stood above another. From his perspective, that dream was already beginning to fail. The more he reflected upon the village they had built, the more convinced he became that peace founded upon trust alone could never endure. As long as human beings possessed ambition, fear, and the desire for power, conflict would inevitably return. Eventually, Madara made the decision to leave Konoha. He departed without his clan, without an army, without the friend who had stood beside him since childhood. The village remained behind, continuing to prosper under Hashirama's leadership, while Madara disappeared into the wider shinobi world. Many believed his story had come to an end. It had not. Separated from the village, Madara began searching for answers that lay far older than Konoha itself. His investigations eventually led him to the ancient stone tablet hidden within the Uchiha clan's shrine, a relic left behind Hagoromo Otsutsuki, and readable only through the power of the Sharingan. What Madara read upon that tablet changed the course of history. Believing he had uncovered the Sage of Six Paths' true path to lasting peace, he reached a conclusion that stood in direct opposition to everything Hashirama had fought to create. The next time Madara returned to Konoha, he would not return as its founder. he would return as its greatest enemy.